Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but I'm also the director of the centre. And today I'm very excited because I am joined by a new to me writer from Germany called Kathrin Tordasi. So Kathrin, first of all, have I got your name right? Have I said that?
Yeah, that's fine.
In the ballpark. And I had great pleasure reading Catherine's new book, Bramble Fox. Well, it's new to translation, which is published by Pushkin Press. And I thought Catherine would be a wonderful person to talk to for many reasons, but mostly because this is a fantastic fantasy book for children. So first of all, Catherine, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to becoming a writer? And also perhaps where you're sitting right at this moment.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast. It's a real pleasure, and I'm really glad I get to do this. So thank you very much. Yeah, right now I'm sitting in Berlin, in my little flat on the rooftop, so to speak. And yeah, I've been living here for 10 years now. And yeah, this is where I live and work if I'm not traveling. And yeah, Bramble Fox is my first, my debut novel. It came out in 2020. It's a fantasy for children, and I'm very chuffed that it got picked up by Pushkin Press and translated. It was the whole process was actually very lovely, and a big thank you to Pushkin Press again, and my editor over there, Daniel Seaton, because I got to work with them on the translation, which is really nice. So I got to sort of see how the book transformed from German to English. Yeah, I've been writing or telling stories. Sometimes it feels like forever. So since I was a little kid, my grandma and my mum were big storytellers, and I kind of picked it up from them. So, and then just never stopped. And then when I got a bit older, I wanted to do something with literature. And as you do, you do something. I wanted to be a writer for as long as I knew that it's a job, but then you go and do something sensible. Go to university, and I studied German literature and English literature, and studied in Wales for a while. Then came back to Germany, got a PhD, taught English literature and cultural studies for a couple of years here in Berlin. And then I started publishing books, children's books. Bramble Fox, or the German Brombeer Fuchs, was the first. A couple have now followed. I'm still on it. And yeah, since of this year, I switched jobs, and I'm working as a full-time writer and translator now.
Well, first of all, congratulations, because people listening may not know how difficult it is to make, all the pieces of things you do as an author add up to something that pays the bills. So well done.
Mm-hmm.
That's an
Thank you.
in itself. We also, just before we move on, we should do a shout out to the translator of Bramble Fox for those reading in English, Katrin Wirtz. Wirtz?
Wirtz, yeah.
I don't speak German, but I sort of knew that WWBs. I suspect, Kathrin, that you've sort of given me the answer to the first question I have for you, which is one of the things that surprised me when I started reading Bramble Fox is Bramble Fox. It's set in Wales, and it draws on the fairy lore of Wales, as well as Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dreams. So the first question I have is, you're sitting in Berlin. What made you want to write a story set in Wales?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, big shout out to Katrin Wirtz, who wrote a really excellent translation. It was such an amazing experience to read a story that I've written, translated into another language, and she did this really beautifully. I already told her via email, but if she's listening to this, thank you, Katrin, once again. why did I choose to have this story and have Wales as a setting? Yeah, I lived in Wales, in North Wales, in Bangor for about a year, and I really loved it there. So it was a great time for me. It was a very formative year as well. So towards the end of my studies, and I loved the landscape. It's a very Bangor is sort of situated between the sea and Snowdonia National Park. So you have mountains, you have the coastline. I'm very big on hiking, so I was outdoors a lot. And I also really enjoyed the university program there. So Bangor University, took a couple of classes, also got into archery, which was fun. And yeah, I have an archery club at that's what I did for a while. And yeah, when I was there, I went on hikes. I always had my notebook with me and started to sort of collect impressions of the places that I would visit and the different kinds of legends and folklore elements that I came into contact with. And yeah, so that's how the first ideas for the Bramble Fox stories got together. And then I got to read, I think it's Charlotte Guest's version of the Mabinogion, which is this collection of the Welsh Welsh mythological and folkloristic stories that inspired a lot of the King Arthur lore, for example. And there I first came across Anun and Around, and so that sort of lodged in there. I read then more recently I came across a Welsh artist called CCJ Ellis, who did a wonderful art book on Welsh monsters and creatures. So there's a bit of inspiration there. And yeah, I also when I wrote the book, the privilege Dysgu Cymraeg department at Bangor University, who helped me with research questions and language checks and so on. So it's yeah, born out of a stay turned into sort of a formative year for me in Wales.
Yeah, so we should mention, for those of you who love your Welsh language or just love languages, anyone who likes Tolkien's languages will know that it's based on Welsh, or partly. Is there, you're using, and there's a little list of vocab at the back, you're using the Welsh language as part of the texture and feeling of the tale. And also just do a sort of promo for this podcast, if you go back a couple of episodes to the Welsh episode, you can hear us talking to Claire Fair, who's a Welsh lady who collects Welsh tales. So this will
lovely
follow on after you've heard Kathrin speak today. So I was also interested. So there you've got Wales as one centre for the story, but you then have many of the characters from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Midsummer Night's Dream has an element of existing folkloric characters and ones that Shakespeare made up and for his purposes of his play. But that's obviously he's a man from Stratford upon Avon, an Englishman. So how did you go along with the idea of incorporating the Welsh tradition with the English tradition? Or was your fact that you are from Germany mean that you could just ignore all that and just say, right, all in the same world?
Well, I would call my method perhaps irreverent homage. So it's I'm kind of, I mean, I studied English literature, so Shakespeare was very big, of course, in the courses that I took, and A Midsummer Night was one of the plays that fascinated a lot. And I was also always fascinated by by sort of the myth surrounding Shakespeare, the author. So these questions of where did he get his ideas? Did he write the plays? Did someone else write the plays? So all these different kinds of yeah, myths and questions and stuff. So what I did when I wrote Bramble Fox, I knew that I wanted to include fairy lore, and always appreciated, or what I've been fascinated by when it comes to the use of myth and folklore in literature is how these myths and legends overlap and transfer and transform in different cultures, but also in different types of literature, and how they get reread and rewritten. So this kind of pastiche or bricolage of different motifs put together into retellings and slightly askew stories of other material. I always liked when I read books that did that. So that was something that I wanted to try out. And in Wales, you have a lot of fairy lore. They're called or one term that is used there, Tylwyth Teg, so the fair family, as a sort of collective term for fairies or elves. What I did for Brahms, I sort of imagined Shakespeare as a traveler between worlds. So I thought, what if he actually went through a portal like the children in the books and visited the fairy world and came back with a bag full of stories, but he's made up to that more entertaining. And there was in an early Bramble Fox, there was this scene where Titania complained about him writing A Midsummer Night Donkey Story is pure fabrication. So it's a bit of silliness, to be honest, coming from an English literature student.
I think you're perfectly allowed to do that, because obviously here at the Oxford Centre of Fantasy, one of our sort of other touchstones is the Narnia stories, and C.S. Lewis completely mixes up, Greek mythology and all sorts of Arthurian legends, and he just goes, "Oh, okay, chuck a bit of this in, bit of that." He's like that. He's like that chef who goes around the kingdom, around the kitchen, pulling everything out of the cupboards to put into his kingdom. So, I mean, you've just touched on it, but another way of describing Bramble Fox is that it's a portal fantasy, which we've had. Well, it's in folklore, the doors in the hillside, you go through into another world, and you get it in literature, in Alice in Wonderland, and back to C.S. Lewis again. How did you come up with your version of the portal leading into this liminal land of a land of mist that sits between our world and many worlds, but including the world of the Fae?
Yeah, so liminal space, I find the idea behind that quite fascinating. So this idea that there are places where our understanding of reality dissolves, like threshold places, or even a space in time where we transition from one state of being to another. And of course, there's also the real life or metaphorical implications of that. There's tons of cultural studies on the idea of liminal rituals or liminal states of being that people in basically all societies that we know have to go through in order to grow up. So coming of age rituals would be one example, where you're sort of caught between the status of a child and a grown-up, and then you go through a kind of ritual, and then you sort of slip into this new identity. And I really like this idea that you have to go through a sort of in-between phase. And for Ben and Portia, the borderlands between the human world and the fairy world, they signify exactly that. So they have to go through this place in order to distance themselves from the world they know, but also from their own place in the world. So they change quite a lot in this book. Ben needs to find more confidence and move a little bit out of his shell, and also confront his own personal grief. And Portia will discover that there's a certain wilderness in her that she has to contend with. So it's, I like this idea of the transition that you have to that sort of unlocks things.
So for people who are wondering, what kind of book this is that we're reading. I think that as having read it, I would say that it feels like quite a traditional children's tale in the sense of you've got children, well, one child going away to stay with relatives because her mother's in a bad place, who discovers the secret in the house, and has the spooky presence of a fox who keeps turning up, and she follows the fox, and the fox wants something from her. She doesn't know what, but she kind of gets led along. Her name's Portia. And then the other main character is a boy called Ben that you've just mentioned, who is sort of following on behind when Portia opens the door to the other world. So it's got a lot of air of mystery. It reminded me of things like Tom's Midnight Garden, books by Susan Cooper, those sorts of stories. So it's a wonderful read. So
thank you so much. That's quite a flattering comparison.
There's lots of characters there's lots of things to discuss, but one thing that I was thinking about it as from the point of view of also being a writer of fantasy is that you have in it a very interesting take on good and evil, in that the Bramble Fox, who I don't actually want to say who he is because it kind of it's a nice plot twist, but the Bramble Fox himself and Titania, who is the queen of the fairies, who we go on to meet, they are fearsome and they have their own agenda. And so do you think that having this, you can't say they're evil though, they're not like on the same scale as the humans in the story. So do you think it's important to complicate what's good and evil in fantasy? Because your big baddie, actually, just thinking about him, the Grey King, who is this presence in the very scary presence in the liminal land of mists. Arguably, he's not bad either. He's just in the wrong place, is my take on him.
Yeah.
So tell me about your sort of take on good and evil and how we should approach it in fantasy.
Oh, thank you. That is a great question and a big question. I mean, the short answer is yes. I think it's important to have gray characters to, as you say, to complicate this distinction between good and evil, especially in stories that are about a fight between what we might call the good side and the bad side. And I have to say, I really struggle with categorical distinctions between good and bad a lot. Because I think on the one hand, there's something deeply satisfying in reading and writing. You probably have this experience as well, where there's a clear distinction between good and bad, perhaps because it speaks to this wish or desire we have that there are people or causes that are fundamentally good and they will prevail in the end. And while I also think that it's important to critically reflect on what's morally right and wrong, and it's sometimes also crucial to point out in no uncertain terms that certain acts or behaviors are bad in the sense that they hurt, discriminate against, or otherwise harm people. I also think that good and bad can be a tricky binary, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think good people can be flawed, right? And bad people can have relatable motives. And to simplify that in stories, to take away the complexity, I fear it can encourage skewed expectations about people in real life. So for example, it could encourage the presumption that people can only be good if they never make a mistake, or that they can't be good if they also have selfish motives. Or perhaps people might be blindsided when someone who does bad things has a big following because they can't fathom or understand how that person manages to tap into an emotional need shared by their followers. So, yeah, I think it's important to have a spectrum of complex characters in stories, and in fantasy stories especially, because they are so often woven from similar stuff than archaic myths about good and evil.
Yeah, I think that's why the world of fae is really interesting, because they've always in folklore they've stood aside. You know, they've not been part of the religious world. They've always been separate. So having their own politics, their own reasons, and it's been a useful third point on the triangle of good, bad, and fae over there.
Chaotic sometimes.
Yeah, and another favorite quote, which I always tell my writing students, is from Terry Pratchett, who says, "Dark Lords should be rationed." I
love that.
When you look at Tolkien, obviously, what's interesting about Tolkien is that yes, that he has the bad Dark Lord of them all. You know, originally Melkor in Morgoth in the Silmarillion, but then Sauron. So he's keen on Dark Lords, but actually, when you follow his story, he's not that interested in Sauron in Lord of the Rings. He's really interested in what happens when the evil goes out into society and starts to affect people like Denethor, Saruman, Boromir. That's where Gollum, wow, you know,
definitely
is in the Shades of Grey. And I've always thought that in the Harry Potter universe, that the strongest character for them, the evil side, is not Voldemort, who is wonderful as played by Ralph Fiennes, and you know, great, but actually it's Dolores Umbridge.
Oh gosh, yeah.
You know, the apparatchik who is just dire. So I actually find those kind of characters far more interesting than the uber bad guy who, well, okay, they're bad, you know.
Yeah.
Cute,
I mean,
Eilish, you know, that's the yeah.
Definitely. I mean, it makes it easier to dismiss them, right? As the like Sauron, who's so you know, so profoundly, clearly evil, that you can push them sort of away in saying, okay, this is what we need to fight against, but this will never, I will never be in danger of becoming like that or becoming corrupted by that. So, and I think it's dangerous to I really like the Terry Pratchett quote. It's dangerous to assume that, or to see evil always as something this big and huge and externalized, and not as a more force that can have an impact in so many ways, and that we have to engage with in ourselves as well. And I think that's one thing that Tolkien does really well, doesn't he? This idea of how it's not just how do I face an external threat, but also how do I deal with my own fears and flaws and shortcomings, and what makes us human is that we are flawed, but we can still do good things. But
I mean, what he does is evil as embodied by the ring, which is kind of like Sauron in ring form. It's a test, and it shows where people fall on that scale of good and bad. Whereas with you, going back to the Bramble Fox, you make sure your two child characters are tested by in different ways. This is really fascinating. They're on a separate journey, and they spend quite large parts of it apart as well. It's not a kind of famous 5 story where people go off together and spend it together. They've got their separate temptations. And I wanted to ask you about the temptation for Ben, which is the bereavement story. And did you have any sort of thoughts about how to handle this and put it across to a younger reader? I mean, because obviously it's a big theme in going back to Harry Potter. Bereavement is a big theme in Harry's backstory, and something like The Magician's Nephew, it's C.S. Lewis sort of rerunning his own mother's death, but doing it a happy ending. Where were you going with that in your thoughts about sensitive handling of that hardest of themes?
I thought about this quite a lot, and that was one aspect of the story that was really important to me to get right, or as right as I could. I think when we're dealing with these big things like death and loss and grief, I think it's important that they have a place in children's literature, because, I mean, the sad truth is we all have to engage with these aspects of life and the feelings that they might bring up. And for some, this moment, or perhaps even in the form of first-hand experience of loss, comes quite early in life. So children will be confronted with illness and death. So in the book, Ben's father has died a year before the story starts. He's died of cancer, and Ben is still dealing with the grief of that. And so I think kids will be confronted with death in real life. It's too big a part of our existence and of our media, frankly, for them to not become aware of it. And it can be really scary and confusing. So I get why people might want to protect their children from becoming aware of it or confronting it for as long as possible. So that's very relatable and sensible. But I also think that it makes it easier to deal with the big things, the things that scare us, if we understand that it's a shared experience, and something that's woven into everyone's lives, not something that we have to deal with alone without having any reference to how others experience loss and grief. And I think that's actually what stories can do. So they can show us that we're not alone with what we're fearing or feeling or hoping. And when it comes to stories that talk about death, I think they can acknowledge death as a part of the experience of living, but they can also show the many ways in which people can comfort each other, how they can love each other through difficult times, and how they can ground themselves, recover a sense of joy and of safety, or simply how to move with grief and how to carry it as you go forward. And to share a bit of that was my hope with when I wrote Bramble Fox. Yeah, so that was part of my process there.
And the other thing, on the sort of scale of difficult things to write for a younger audience, is that it's actually very scary in parts.
Yes.
this grey world, this misty world, and there's a character, another borrowing from Shakespeare, Hermia, who has been left behind and kind of taken over by the mist. Did you? I mean, it's fun to indulge in the nightmare stuff, but again, how did you think about that in terms of the age of the audience and how you would deal with it?
I mean, on a very practical level, I have a couple of kids who read my stories before they go to the publisher. So, and I'm talking with them about what their thoughts on certain scenes or images are, and and I do this in also in collaboration with their parents. So it's a sort of like a better reading book club that we have going on. So that helps a lot. And also, yeah, the book it has these sort of eerie, creepy parts about it, and that is mainly the reason. The reason behind that is the kind of story that I loved to read as a kid. So
Yeah.
I was one of those kids who loved to get goosebumps and to be a little scared when I was reading a story. So one of the books and movies that had a real big impact on me was Michael Ende's The Never Ending Story. And I don't know, have you seen the movie version of that? I think
No,
it's
I've
an
read the book.
80s. Yeah, and in the movie version, the images you get of the Gmorg, this wolf-like creature that sort of pursues the protagonist, or the swamps of sadness. So that is very horror-esque as well. And I know that this really left an imprint. But as in terms of how to sort of deal with or prepare kids or talk to kids who want to read this story. I think it very much depends on the kid. I mean, I know readers aged 10 who love Goosebumps and as much as I did as a kid, but I also know kids who don't want to watch Finding Nemo because they find this the
Too
shark
scary.
too scary. Yeah, and I mean that's perfectly fine. You know, it's all depending on the individual kid. And I think perhaps the best thing that parents or other adults who take care of children can do is to take an interest in what they like to read and to talk with them about it and be there when they have questions or the need to discuss something.
Yes, I don't want to give people the wrong impression. It's definitely within the Goosebumps territory rather than the sort of screaming, running behind the sofa territory. One of the things, Kathrin, you've done is what they did in Jurassic Park, the first movie, is the people who get the most scary things happen to them are adults.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think there is an element, as long as it's not the children,
Mm-hmm.
you can get away with most things because adults, you know, it's a bit of it's okay, I'm safe kind of feeling.
Yeah.
So
And I mean, I hope it balances out so the kids get to do really cool stuff in the book as well. So Portia gets to transform into an animal. I'm not revealing which animal right now because it's a sort of a surprise to her as well. And Ben gets to visit an underground mystical library and learns to do a bit of magic stuff. So I think it's all in the balance with the grief as well. So grief can be in there, but then there also needs to be comfort. There needs to be a sense of safety, of being protected. So
yeah, it's not Game of Thrones. It's, you know.
No, definitely not.
It was the wrong impression. People thought, oh, it's going to be really horrific. It's not. So when I was reading it, there were several moments where I wanted to shout at the hero characters, don't do it. Don't open the door. Don't open the don't follow the fox, and so on. How much fun was it writing those moments when you know your audience is going to be like really angry of your characters for being, you know, doing the into the haunted house then?
Oh, lots of fun. Lots of fun. I mean, that's when people make mistakes, when they run headlong into disaster because they're convinced they have to for some reason. That's when the good stuff happens, in my opinion, when you write. I don't know about you. Is that your experience when you write?
Yeah, definitely. I suppose it depends, doesn't it? Sometimes because you know the full picture, that you don't get the same feeling because it's you're taking them through it and you're just really enjoying taking them through it. Bad things have to happen to characters in order to have a plot. But I feel it more as a reader, I think, than as a writer. You know, that sensation is much more when I'm not in control of the process, and I can't stop. Whereas if I'm the writer, I've got the choice, and so I can throw them in. You know,
that's true. That's true. No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, as a reader, it's a little bit like watching a football game, isn't it? I mean, you have this view of the whole field, and you can say, "Oh, pass the ball! Can't you see?" But when you're exactly.
Wow.
But the characters in the story, they don't have the full picture. So I had readers write to me because Portia makes a bad decision when she comes into fairyland, and people have written to me and said, "Oh gosh, I don't get why she did that at this point." And I said, "Yeah, it wasn't a good decision, but at the moment she was in a situation of where she was emotionally very stressed, and sometimes you don't make the best decisions in the situation, especially if you don't have the full picture."
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned Michael Ender's book in passing. Just thinking more broadly, you've done study in English literature and German literature. Do you see a difference between the German tradition of fantasy, looking at it in the broadest possible strokes, to the English tradition? Is there something you think, oh, you know, that's really Germanic, that part of it is really, you know.
Yeah, I hope I don't get myself into how do you say, into hot waters, deep waters. What is the phrase?
Hot water. Hot water is
hot
good.
water. When I talk about this, so I'm by no means an expert, but I have some thoughts on this. So in Germany, there's a long tradition actually of texts that incorporate magical and fantastical elements, yeah, especially during the Romantic period, with texts like Goethe's Faust, or E.T.A. Hoffmann's Der Sandmann, or Ludwig Tieck's Der Runenberg. So those are texts whose settings are closely modeled on the real world, with fantastical elements bleeding into the everyday. And we also had a similar trend to the rise and popularity of Gothic fiction in the UK and throughout Europe during the, I think, late 18th, early 19th century. So, but overall, my sense is that historically in Germany, there's a bit more magical realism or proto-urban fantasy going on than high fantasy, like what Tolkien did, for example, this whole fantastical world building. And I mean, as for more recent years, very generally speaking, if I compare, and I'm biased, yeah? So,
Well, we all are.
disclaimer. But if I compare the role of fantasy literature in the German literary canon with its role in British literary canon, I'd say there's a notable difference in terms of canonization, maybe, or appreciation even. So for one, British academia seems a lot more, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems a lot more comfortable with including fantasy and science fiction in their curricula these days.
Yeah.
And the recognition of these genres as worthwhile research subjects has started a lot earlier in the UK than it has in Germany. And same goes for the field of literary criticism outside of university. So in Germany, the literary feuilleton still maintains a very stark division between realist fiction and fantasy fiction. And there has been pushback, and there's, of course, a lot of great research on fantasy literature in Germany going on as well. You have the Library for Fantasy Literature in Wetzlar and the Forschungsinstitut für fantastische Literatur. So there's a lot going on, but fantasy literature still has a harder time getting critical or academic attention over here, which I personally think is, as I said, I'm biased. I personally think it's a shame, because there's a lot of great books out there which excel in creative world building, and they use magic as a metaphor for all kinds of issues kids and adults are dealing with. And maybe as a last point, all that said, the genre is vastly popular in Germany. Yeah, so lots of people read it, not only but especially in the field of children's literature. So some of our most popular and nationally and internationally successful authors have written children's fantasy. Michael Ende, who we already mentioned. You have Cornelia Funke and Paul Maar, to name just a few of those. And I'm also very excited about current trends in German fantasy literature, which is getting increasingly creative and loud with regards to celebrating diversity. So with an increasing number of fantasy books, including or focusing on queer and BIPOC characters. So that's really something that I am celebrating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely happening in the British tradition as well. Front covers are changing, for example. You know, you can see that the heroes, heroines are from all walks of life, and people are also looking into folkloric myths from lots of different cultures, not just the sort of, UK centered ones. So you mentioned some there. Is there a underrated German fantasy series that we should look up? I mean, I know of the ones you've mentioned. I know Cornelia Funke and Michael Ende already. Cornelia Funke was really big when my children were reading. I don't know if she still is. I haven't, now they're growing up. I'm not talking the children's tales as much. But certainly that they all were reading her. But is there someone we're missing that we need to know about in the English-speaking world?
I mean, I could recommend a couple that I think would do really lovely in translation, but let me think about this for a second. I mean, one fantasy author that, I mean, he's definitely not underrated in Germany, but I don't know how widely he is known in an English-speaking context, is Ottfried Preußler, who is a children's book author who wrote in the 70s. So his books are more on the classical side. And one of the books I can definitely recommend is Krabat and the Sorcerer's Mill, which also deals a lot with Slavic folklore in that case. So it's a bit fairy tale fantasy-ish for younger readers. That one. Two series for young readers that have a lot of fans in Germany at the moment are one is called Die Flüsterwald Chroniken, so the Chronicles of the Whispering Woods by Andreas Suchanek, and shapeshifter series called Woodwalkers by Katja Brandis. And there's also one book that is very, not a series, but one book that's very near and dear to my heart, because I got to watch it sort of grow from first idea to finished book. And that's Christian Handel's Rowan and Ash, which is a lovely gay young adult fantasy with fairy tale and folklore elements. Which is not translated in English yet, but I'm hoping that will change. So yeah,
some of our listeners may be German readers, so they can go out and get that now.
Yeah, definitely.
We have to mention in that mix, we mustn't forget the Bramble Fox by Kathrin Tordasi.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kathrin, for talking to us. And as an end, we always choose some theme, imagining that we can pick any fantasy world. It can be something that's in a TV series or on film or in a old series or a new book series. Basically, it just has to be a fantasy world. And we pick where is the best place to be or do something. So, you know, we've picked things like the best tavern or the best place in the castle, you know, that kind of thing. This time, in honor of you and for the way that your story begins, I thought, where is the best place to go and stay with an aunt? People may think, oh, that's a strange thing to pick, but actually, no. When you start to think about how many great children's stories start, they start with getting rid of the parents.
Yes, that's true.
Or maiden aunts and great aunts are usually kind of these slightly neglectful stand-in parent figures. So where would you go and stay with an aunt, hoping to have an amazing adventure?
Oh, I love this question. I mean, as is probably noticeable in Bramble Fox as well, I love food, and I love sitting somewhere cozy and having tea or a picnic. So I guess for a nice picnic, maybe 500-acre woods or Hobbiton would be a good place. Or I've very recently I've gotten into Thomas Taylor's Erie-on-Sea books, which is also a fantasy adventure series for kids, where you have this coastal town of Erie-on-Sea, and they have really good fish and chips alongside very funny and weird and exciting monster hunts. So that actually might be a place where I would go to visit an aunt.
So I was asking myself the same question. I use this in my very first fantasy series for children. I set my character away to stay with an aunt, which is why I thought about this. The Companions Quartet. But thinking about this, we've mentioned it once already. I seem to remember at the beginning of Tom's Midnight Garden, he goes to stay with his relatives. I can't remember exactly, an aunt, possibly an aunt, because his brother had scarlet fever or something. Anyway, he's sent away because of illness in the household. And I've always loved that idea of this house with the clock that strikes 13 and you travel back in time. So I think I'd go to Philippa Pierce's Tom's Midnight Garden world to go and stay with an aunt. Less food.
That sounds lovely.
More time.
That sounds lovely.
Thank you so much, Kathrin. It's been wonderful talking to you today, and I wish you all the best with Bramble Fox as it's now coming out in English, published by Pushkin Press.